right to an education. So she has standing before the courts. And then we use U.S. law and our relationships with those governments in order to enforce that. I'd like to ask all of our presenters to join me at this time. I'd like to have Jamie and Tammy and Letitia and Gigi come up, if you will, to allow me to present you with a small gift to thank you for making our conference a wonderful event. And I'll ask Marie, would you like to come up too?
Chef Jamie had to leave early. She's hosting Easter at her house, and when you're a celebrity chef, there's a lot of pressure. So far, we have the greatest speakers ever. And most of them will be hanging around for a little while in the front row, so you can come thank them later, get a hug, get a selfie, whatever we need to do. I would also like to say that this is the first year we've ever actually been on time, so I'm really excited about this. And I look forward to talking too long and putting us behind. So I'm going to get started. My name is Sara. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet, I'm Congressman Ed Royce's Deputy Chief of Staff. I have worked for him for 14 years, and I have had the pleasure of running this women's conference for the last 8 years. So you've heard several times already that we talked about the surveys. I think we've plugged it at least 3 times. Feedback? Is that okay? So we've talked about our surveys, and part of the importance of that is that every year we ask you, what do you want to see? What's that Syria is making artillery? The third image is something that we do not expect to see when we talk about trafficking, especially sex trafficking. These are American teenage girls on the street here in the United States. And it's definitely not a faraway crime. It is right here in our neighborhoods. When it comes to human trafficking, there are so many horror stories that we could go through, and I had really struggled with how to convey that today without having testimonial after testimonial and horror story after horror story. So I tried to break it down as simply as I could, just human trafficking by the numbers, if you will. So 1 in 3, there is 1 incident of sexual exploitation of minors occurring every 3 minutes in the United States, not globally. Really important facts, ladies, this is not an emergency number. If you are witnessing an emergency, you need to call
888.
I might make you do that one every time. It is staffed 24/7, and if you don't know what you see, frequently we hear reports of people who will say things like, well, I saw something and wasn't really sure. Please call. You have professionals on the other end of the line. There's not going to be any judgment. None of you are detectives. We know that. We don't expect you to be. They'll talk through it with you, kind of suss out what you've seen, and see if there's a viable lead to pass on to law enforcement. And these, I guarantee, if you do call and there is a situation, you'll never forgive yourself if you don't act on it, ladies. I can tell you, if you're wondering if any of these actually work, there's also a national hotline set up for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So between that hotline and this hotline, since their inception, they've had 5.4 million calls and tips phoned into these hotlines. And of those tips, 40% of those tips came from community members like you. Extreme power team. We did a field hearing on human trafficking at this very site. Where's Owen? Good time, right? Owen, we packed the house here, and the congressman called a field hearing on this issue specifically because it was incredibly important to him that we raise the awareness locally. We are not under any misconceptions that all of you watch C-SPAN and that you follow every hearing we do on every issue every day. We wanted to take this show on the road and bring it home to force the local media to pay attention and to hopefully get some of you the opportunity to come watch a congressional hearing. We had victims testify that were both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. We had domestic victims. And we really just tried to bring that, put a face to that issue and to bring it home and to allow you all to see it firsthand. This past fall, we also led our own human trafficking training. If you notice a trend here, if there's a need that we see doesn't get done, we just create one, do it ourselves. Their countries to purchase children for sex. We notify their governments. And Congressman Royce was very instrumental in that bill, crafting it, helping it to get through the committee and through the House. So again, I want to give you something to do. I don't want to discourage you too much. Education, being here today is really the first step. I would just ask you, please don't let it be the last step. It's too important of an issue. Knowing what human trafficking is and how to report it makes you an advocate for these victims. So when you're out, life is crazy, your kids are going bananas, put your phones down. Look up, look around you, look at what you see. And if you see anything that looks remotely like it may be, as I mentioned earlier, call it in. You don't have to know. Don't wait to be sure to call. One other area where you can get involved without even having to leave your home is in the area of consumer demand. These hotels and motels are not going to get involved in the fight to end human trafficking on their own. They have to feel the demand from their consumers. So what I would ask you is the next time you book your travel, whether it's personal or business, ask the front desk, ask to speak to the manager. Are any of your staff trained to detect the signs of human trafficking? Do you know how to report it if you see it? And if not, why not? If you'd like to go a step further, there is something called the Code, and it's the Code to End Human Trafficking. If you go to thecode.org, you will see everybody there who is signed on to help fight end human trafficking. It's hotel chains, it's airlines, everything like that. If you book with any of those companies, and there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of companies listed, if you book with any of them, I would ask that you let them know you chose them because, specifically, of their willingness to end this human trafficking. In terms of prevention, this is where it gets uncomfortable, if you're not already. In terms of prevention, I'm going to talk about this in two ways: preventing demand and preventing victimization. In a recent raid we had in Orange County, in terms of sex purchasers, there was everything from a college student, 20 years old, to a 60-year-old man. There is no one profile, there is no one demographic, but one thing is clear. In Orange County, we are the customer base for this crime. 90%, a little over 90%, roughly 90% of the victims that we have been rescued here in Orange County are from elsewhere in the state. We import them because we're the customer base and this is where the demand is. This would not be a problem in society if we did not have the demand. So what can we do about it? The task force has specific curriculum that they have written, man to give to a man, about what trafficking is, why it's harmful. These girls are not willing. Minors cannot consent to being sold for sexual acts. They've been able to incorporate it in many of them.
That was a really powerful presentation. As Sara said, I'm Jessica Kelch. I'm policy coordinator on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which Representative Royce chairs. So if you hear me referring to him today as Chairman Royce or Chairman, that's why. So you know, the Foreign Affairs Committee is like a sub-organization of Congress that specializes in foreign policy. And that means we cover the whole world. Everything from global trade to the spread of terrorism to sanctions on Iran. So we're dealing with a lot of different issues on any given day. And Chairman Royce's job is to lay out his priorities for the committee and for U.S. foreign policy, and then we work with him and other members of Congress to advance this agenda. Now, Sara just talked about the really appalling occurrence of human trafficking here at home. But this is a global industry, sadly, which disproportionately affects women and girls around the world. And this is obviously a really difficult and disturbing issue. But tragically, it is, in many places, a symptom of a larger disease. And that disease is the lack of basic rights and security for so many women and girls around the world. And so I'm going to be picking up off of Sara's excellent presentation and zooming out of it to speak about the chairman's long-term focus on empowering women and girls, what that means, why we care, and how we're working to advance women and girls' empowerment. But first, I want to start by giving you some examples to explain what I mean by a lack of basic rights and security. And so I'm going to quickly touch on a few of these topics. So I'm going to touch on female infanticide, child marriage, violence against women, maternal mortality, and barriers to education for girls. So looking first at birth and early childhood, one of the first challenges girls face in many places is an overwhelming preference for boys. Many patriarchal societies prefer boys to girls because boys are seen as able to support the family, while girls with limited rights and not always much say in who they marry or where they'll live are viewed as not such a good long-term investment, as this quote reflects. And so in a number of countries, the ratio of boys to girls is becoming increasingly skewed, with boys seriously outnumbering girls due to infanticide of girl babies, extreme neglect of girls, basically withholding food and medicine, or saving it for boys, and increasingly, as the technology becomes available, sex-selective abortion. And the result is that across 16 countries, mainly in Asia and Eastern Europe, almost 120 million girls are missing from the population. To put that in perspective, that is the entire population of Mexico. Another major concern for girls that I want to mention is the practice of child marriage, which continues to be quite prevalent in a number of developing countries. Often the age gap between the girl and the man she marries is very significant, which really limits a girl's agency. As a result, child brides are much more likely to drop out of school and face a greatly increased risk of physical abuse, HIV infection, and death or complications due to pregnancy and childbirth, often because their bodies aren't yet ready for it. I also want to mention levels of violence. Obviously, domestic violence is a serious issue in this country, but I think it's important to note the widespread acceptability of domestic violence in many other places. Polling shows that close to half of all adolescent girls worldwide think a husband is sometimes justified in beating his wife for things like neglecting the women in Iran or Afghanistan who are deemed insufficiently covered in public, or honor killings where girls are murdered by family members for having done something to shame the family, including having been the victims of rape. And I should note that even when violence against women doesn't reach these extremes, the threat of it can really limit a woman's public life. Looking next at the issue of death during childbirth, this is one of the leading causes of death among women in the developing world. Every 90 seconds, a mother dies due to pregnancy-related complications. And as you can see from this graph, these deaths completely dwarf deaths due to all other forms of violent conflict combined. These are really staggering statistics, especially considering that nearly 90% of these deaths during childbirth are preventable. Many countries have just declined to invest in basic services for mothers. And lastly, education. Many girls still receive little to no education compared to boys, and nearly 2/3 of the world's illiterate adults are women. This has negative consequences for families. For example, illiteracy is linked to an increased risk of maternal death, because as you can imagine, women who can't read have a hard time getting good information about their health during pregnancy, as well as at other points in their lives. And I could unfortunately go on and on. I've listed a few more, inequities on this slide, but there are many more topics we could cover. But I want to shift gears and talk about why we care about these issues. Obviously, they constitute serious human rights violations, and many of us feel probably moral outrage when we hear about them. But after initial committee hearing looking at limits to girls' education, the chairman asked me if I would help lead a series of committee hearings that would look specifically at some of these challenges that women and girls face. And the chairman's goal with these hearings was to call attention to these injustices, but also his long-standing belief that I have often heard him express, that the repression of women harms everyone in a society, including men, boys, and a country's institutions. And as I've spent more time working on these issues for him, I've become convinced that he's really onto something. Because I think the chairman actually intuited something earlier in his career that many diplomats and foreign policy experts are just beginning to grasp. And that is that the well-done war. And there is now more and more research proving this point. One study recently calculated that even small advancements in women's equality around the world would have theory boiled down into one sentence, is that boys who grow up watching their fathers and other men abuse women with impunity learn that violence is a socially acceptable way to get what you want, and they inevitably apply this lesson outside the world for our children and grandchildren. Less terrorism, fewer Syrias, an end to transnational gangs. Then any steps we take to improve the status of women and girls around the world will be to our advantage as well as theirs. So these are the key reasons why Chairman Royce has really prioritized the empowerment of women and girls through committee hearings and meetings, proving their age, nationality, birth parents, etc., which makes them vulnerable to trafficking and child marriage. So with this law, this law will help countries learn how to get these birth registration systems up and running. Sara has already talked about our anti-trafficking legislation, so I won't say any more about this issue other than it continues to be an absolute priority. And then lastly, the committee recently passed legislation authorizing what's known as the Global Development Lab. This is a small office that solicits practical, low-cost solutions to global development, global health challenges. And their current focus is on maternal child health. They've found some very creative and inexpensive solutions to other development issues, including stopping the Ebola crisis. So we're excited to see what they come up with in the maternal child health space. And then looking at women's economic empowerment, we passed the Global Food Security Act, which will link small farmers to markets to help prevent widespread famine. And this bill places a particular emphasis on female farmers against girls. They're just not regularly enforced because these are deep-seated biases and traditions that are perpetuated by all of the limits to women's agency and empowerment that we've been discussing today. And so what we know does work is when we're able to support those women and men who are pushing for change within their own societies, because ultimately they're the ones who can and should be leading this fight, and they will have the biggest impact. And there are a few better examples of this than education advocate Malala Yousafzai, who, despite being attacked by the Taliban, is courageously pushing for improvements to girls' education in her native Pakistan and worldwide. And as I said, there's no silver bullet for these deep-seated issues, but education probably comes closest. Because women with an education, and especially women who are literate, have the tools they need to stay healthy and support themselves and their families, and ultimately push for change within their own communities. So we are advancing legislation that prioritizes working with other countries and education advocates like Malala to encourage smarter and better investments in girls' education. So I'll just conclude with a few thoughts on ways to help if you're interested. There are way too many great organizations working to empower women and girls to name. I recommend Charity Navigator to look up ones that interest you. They have lots of recommendations and they rate charities based on their performance and overheads, and you can see where your donation is going. If you are interested in making donations to international groups, just keep in mind that usually volunteering time or money is better than donating clothing or food because shipping costs can really dilute the value of those in-kind contributions. Your outreach to members of Congress really does make a difference, so please come see me or reach out to Sara if you're interested in getting involved in that way. And lastly, I want to challenge everyone here, women and men, to find ways to stand with and support women and girls in your own life. We live in an increasingly interconnected world, and you would be surprised at the ways in which we influence others, even outside our country. I was just talking to an app developer from Africa who's a man, and he was lamenting the lack of US women in STEM careers, and particularly app development, because he wanted to build out his company to be able to market better to female consumers in Africa, and eventually go global, and he wanted American women to help him with this. So that's why I'm so excited we'll be hearing next from Nina Davuluri about the importance of encouraging girls to consider these important fields here at home. So thank you all so much for coming out today. I hope you enjoyed learning more about what we and Chairman Royce are up to, and I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions you have after the conference.
Well, let me just begin here by acknowledging the job that Jessica and Sara do. Jessica, in terms of back in Washington, developing the legislation and the direction that we've been on for the last 3 years and focusing on this issue, and especially Sara for locally figuring out ways to deploy the considerable resources and influences that we all have, whether it's on the hotel industry or for Jessica's part, whether it's the